This lecture will talk about language and communication and specifically address why understanding human language is important. And of course, in the previous lecture, we already discussed how culture is uniquely elaborated in humans and how language is one of those distinctive aspects of culture. So, um, language among humans is also uniquely elaborated. So we'll talk specifically about what makes language different from other forms of communication. That will allow us to address kind of the evolutionary basis for language, because just as we saw that non-human primates possess some of the rudimentary building blocks of human culture, so too do non-human primates, specifically chimpanzees and bonobos, possess some of the rudimentary building blocks or the cognition associated with language. We'll talk about how anthropologists and linguists study language in general and specific languages in particular. And we'll talk about how language changes over both the short and long term time periods. Language is without a doubt, whether written or spoken, is humans' primary means of communication. It follows from those five key features of culture, right? So just as culture is learned, shared, symbolic, um, integrated and all encompassing, so too is language learned, shared, symbolic, integrated, and all encompassing. And so it is critically transmitted through learning. We all have an underlying genetic propensity to pick up language, unless there are developmental problems, neuroarchitecture problems. But the language that we speak is going to be based upon the language that we hear during this period of critical learning. Language is based on arbitrary learned associations between words and symbols and the things that they stand for. And the benefits of language, what language allows us to do, is conjure up elaborate images. It allows us to discuss the past and future. It allows us to share our experiences with others, and it allows us to benefit from others' experiences. So, when we'll talk about a feature that we call cultural consolidation. And that is essentially the real benefit that language gives us, is that it allows us to build up a collective knowledge base based on generations of people's experiences, which means that in times where changes are happening, particularly changes that are pretty rare, like let's say long-term climate cycles, etc. Having that knowledge base that we've built up through cultural consolidation allows us to cope with very rare events, right? It gives us a bigger set of experiences to draw from, to the point that we don't have to have directly experienced circumstances to be able to solve those problems. Anthropologists, of course, study language, not only like the structure of language, but language in its social and cultural context. So we have to start with what other species possess. Okay, non-human primates possess, by and large, and basically non-human animals possess call systems. Call systems are communication systems that use a limited number of sounds that are produced in response to specific stimuli. Call systems or calls are automatic and cannot be combined. And critically, at some point in our evolutionary history, our ancestors began to combine calls and to understand combinations. So, what we're seeing with this slide here are vervet monkeys. Vervet monkeys live kind of alongside chimpanzees and baboons in many areas of Africa. I mean, they're more arboreal than baboons are. But vervet monkeys have been studied in detail because of their alarm calls. And that's what you see here on the left. You see some of these call diagrams, and here on the right, you see what some of their predators are. And so, specifically, vervet monkeys are hardwired and able to make vocalizations that are species specific in terms of predator species specific. And those vocalizations have very different characteristics. So, for example, when vervet monkeys are faced with an arboreal predator, or like an avian predator, that's all of these different hunting like hawks and eagles and such, the call that they make is very diffuse and very high pitched. And that call then serves to warn everybody that they need to hide, but it's also the characteristics of the sounds are what we would call not localizable. So it's like a high pitched whistle that birds can't pinpoint who's making that vocalization. And that's critical for being able to hide and stay safe from avian predators, right? Because when you think about the way that avian predators hunt, what they're doing is they're trying to pinpoint a single animal, and then they swoop down and take that animal away. And so if the alarm calls were localizable, where the bird would be able to pinpoint whoever's making that call, then by vocalizing and warning others of predators, you would raise that risk of being picked off yourself, right? Of being the prey item that the bird makes or successfully takes. Um, by contrast, when vervets are faced with what we would consider like a terrestrial predator, something like a snake, the qualities of their vocalizations are incredibly different. And these vocalizations are incredibly localizable. These vocalizations also trigger mobbing type behavior, so that basically the vervets are sitting around looking at the snake and hollering, "Snake, snake, I see you. Look, everybody, it's a snake." Everybody comes over and points at it and raises a ruckus. And the snake generally ends up not being successful in the hunt. And this also is an adaptation to the ways that snakes hunt. Snakes rely on stealth, terrestrial predators rely on stealth, right? They want to get as close as possible to their prey item before they are able to strike. And so they're relying on staying hidden. And so by inciting this mobbing sort of behavior, the vervets are really kind of ensuring that that element of stealth is removed for the snake, so that the snake is thusly going to be unsuccessful in being able to make its way off with a prey item. So, some of the other interesting things that we see with vervets and call systems in general is that they're innate. Vervets, regardless of where they've grown up and what predators they've been exposed to, vervets make the correct species alarm calls when faced with a predator of that type. So, captive vervets that are living in zoo settings make the right alarm call, even if they've never been picked off by or seen like a hawk or an eagle or a snake. Um, we also find that um, these alarm calls are not generalizable. So, when faced with an avian predator, they're always going to make that avian style alarm call, right? They're not going to co-opt that into an alarm call for some other kind of predator. They're not going to combine these terms and come up with an alarm call for something new. So these are hardwired, innate kinds of vocalizations. So, alarm calls, call systems are not language. Okay. If we are hardwired, if we have the genetic basis to make a particular call when we are faced with a particular stimulus, that is no more than a call system. Now, can call systems be interesting to study in and of themselves? Yes, absolutely. And there are some things that vervets do with their calls that are kind of interesting. One of those is that um, when we compare captive and wild vervets, in captivity, high ranking and low ranking vervets are just as likely to make the alarm calls. There's no difference based on rank. In the wild, low ranking vervets detect predators just as often as high ranking vervets do, but they alarm call a lot less frequently. So basically, they're detecting predators and they're choosing to stay quiet. So it's not quite as cut and dry as it seems at first glance, right? There's some manipulation and some deception that goes on with vervets when they're making a decision of whether to make an alarm call or not, right? The benefit for the vervet that stays quiet, who's low rank, is that presumably that predator might pick off a higher ranking individual, which means that vervet will be able to it will be able to rise in rank and have priority of access to key critical resources. So interesting stuff. It's not quite as cut and dry. All right. So, what about other kinds of linguistic systems? Okay. Chimpanzees have hardwired calls. There is one call that they make that they always make this vocalization when they are faced with some really super yummy, coveted food item. And interestingly, chimpanzees know that they're going to make this vocalization. And what that vocalization does is brings all, my milkshakes bring all the boys to the yard, right? That vocalization brings all of the competitors to that food source. And so chimps don't necessarily want to make that call because if they make that call and competitors come, right, they're going to have to share that food source. So chimpanzees know that they make that call. And interestingly, what they do when faced with some magnificent food item is they cover their mouths and they try to muffle that call. So definitely, there are some aspects of chimpanzee communication that are hardwired and chimps recognize that they are hardwired and that they're going to make that vocalization no matter what. And they then behaviorally try to muffle that vocalization so their competitors don't come. So, some really interesting stuff that chimps do, even with respect to hardwired calls. Um, but these hardwired vocalizations that chimps make are not language, right? So there's been some work. It was particularly done through like the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. There were a lot of psychologists who did some cognitive work with great apes. And I mean, this is not. There's still um, like cognitive psychology work being done with apes, and some of these have i- been determined to be kind of exploitative and stuff. So it's not like a happy story, but chimps were taught. Chimps and gorillas were taught how to use American Sign Language. And what this has shown is that chimps and gorillas, at the very least, have a rudimentary capacity for language. The building blocks of language, the cognition of language, is present in chimps and gorillas. So the first to learn were Washoe and Lucy. After they learned how to sign, they would exhibit human traits such as swearing, joking, telling lies, and trying to teach language to others. And this was followed by Project NIM with less impressive results. You guys can have another extra credit opportunity if you'd like, and that is to watch the movie Project NIM, the one that starred Jodie Foster. So it's kind of sad. I just want to preface it with that knowledge so that you don't blame me for like ruining your day or something like that. So in many cases, um, these chimps were raised in human-like conditions where they wore clothes, they wore diapers, they were allowed to bed share with their human caretakers, and by and large, once these chimps then started to reach puberty, they became disruptive. They became destructive. They became harder to control, and so in many cases, these chimps were then sold into the biomedical industry, which for an animal as long-lived as a chimp, I mean, it's cruelty. It is absolute cruelty to go from treating them like and raising them as if um, they're a member of your family to abandoning them to biomedical research. So definitely a checkered past. Thankfully, we are making strides since about 2015 to eliminate some of the cognition research and kind of exploitative research that we've been doing on chimps. All right, so what the sign language chimps and gorillas have shown us are three key features of language. So, yes, language, just like culture, has these aspects of being shared, symbolic, etc. But looking at what chimps are able to do with American Sign Language versus kind of spoken language or vocalizations highlights some characteristics of language that are critically important. Specifically, language for a call system for a system of communication to qualify as language, it needs to demonstrate cultural transmission. That is, language is learned. And so cultural transmission of communication system through learning is a fundamental aspect of language. Um, and so Washoe and Lucy absolutely tried to teach American Sign Language to other animals, including their own offspring. Coco the gorilla, who recently passed away, what tried to teach American Sign Language to the kittens that she had. Now, Coco was one of these situations where it was kind of exploitative. There was a lot of potential ethical violations going on. Coco killed a bunch of the kittens that she tried to teach sign language to because they couldn't move their paws in the way that Coco wanted them to move their paws, and she got kind of upset about it. So that, yeah, I mean, these giving large-bodied great apes eh, pets like cats, no, not always a good idea, right? They are wild animals. They are certainly able to hurt things that are smaller than them. Productivity is the second key feature of language. I don't know why my bullet points got off a little bit. Productivity and displacement should be back kind of aligned with cultural transmission. Productivity is where you use the rules of language to produce new expressions. And so Coco, Washoe, and Lucy all created new words from their language rules. So when they saw a watermelon, they called it a drink fruit. When they saw a swan, they called it a water bird. When they saw a ring, they called it a finger bracelet. So, the interesting ways that like kids innovate new terminology for things using the existing rules that they have, right? Great apes are able to do that with American Sign Language. The last key feature that defines a communication system as language instead of a call system is displacement, the ability to talk about things that are not present. And this displacement can be either spatial or temporal. So what that means is that for communication to be classified as language, you either have to be able to talk about things that are not present in the same space. So you might tell someone, go into my office and look in the third drawer on my desk, and you'll find, I don't know, a marshmallow or something like that. Right. Chimps and gorillas can do this. They can talk about things that are in other rooms. They have object permanence and recognize that just because they can't see something doesn't mean that that something ceases to exist. Things can also be temporally displaced in time. So you can talk about events that happened in the past or events that you would like to have happen in the future. And this displacement is routinely used by apes. Coco expressed sadness about having bitten Penny 3 days earlier. Coco also, whenever she didn't want to do something, she would use her sign for later, recognizing that she was committing to doing it sometime in the future. So, um, American Sign Language, or the use of American Sign Language by great apes, uh, by these standards, possessing cultural transmission, productivity, and displacement, absolutely seems to qualify as language. One criticism of the language studies with great apes is that you're raising these apes in a human environment. Do they know then that they're not humans? Right? Or do they think they are humans? And Coco was asked a question about what she was, how she would describe herself, and she signed that she was a fine animal gorilla. So it does appear that they recognize that they're different from their human caretakers. All right, so interesting stuff. This doesn't answer all of our questions about kind of the cognition that is present for non-human primates and specifically great apes. And so there's been some even more interesting work done with common chimps and bonobos using language boards. Orangutans have also been tested with these lexicograms, with these communication boards. That's one question people ask is, why has all this research been done on chimps and gorillas, but we don't hear anything about orangutans? Well, one of the reasons why is that orangutans are generally, when they're in a captive setting, they're generally plotting their escape. They will save up little pieces of metal for like years to eventually craft something that they can use to break out of their enclosure or to lockpick. So they are scheming and certainly capable of some feats of metacognition. It's just that those don't carry over to language because they've got other things on their mind. All right, so this lexigram work began with the LANA project, Language Analog Project at Yerkes in the 1970s. And much of this research has then been conducted at Georgia State University with Sue Savage Rumbaugh. Her husband at the time, Dwayne Rumbaugh, was the one who created this lexigram, these lexicograms or these communication boards. And these communication boards have 384 non-iconic arbitrary symbols. Okay. Remember how we talked about language being symbolic, right? And the difference between just having a picture of an apple for an apple versus having something that's non-iconic, right? We can't really test that symbolism. We can't really test that kind of reliance um, on symbols or symbolic communication if we use iconic uh, lexicograms. So it is critical that these lexicograms be non-iconic. When apes press the key, a digital voice says the word, the lexicograms displayed on a computer screen. Further research with chimps has shown that they could communicate with each other and that they would structure their interactions around statements of planned intent. That is, that they could categorize, pretend, plan, comprehend, and respond to each other. And that is one of the it kind of gets at one of the criticisms of these language studies, right? Is that, oh, it's all well and good for them to be able to do these things in the lab, but the really interesting question is, do they ever do this in the wild, right? What are they capable of in the wild? How are they using language in the wild? And so this does sort of get at the answer to that question. Um, these these apes know who is knowledgeable about the lexicograms and who is not. So they won't try to use them to communicate with someone who doesn't know them. But when they want to communicate something, they will pull each other over to these boards and specifically use these boards to kind of plan what they're going to do. And that is pretty remarkable, right? Being able to plan over the long term um, gives an evolutionary advantage because I mean it represents this key of displacement, right? And planning for the long term allows for larger scale cooperative endeavors uh, versus just planning for the immediacy in the here and now. And so some really remarkable work has been done with bonobos with these communication boards. The star of Sue Savage Rumbaugh's research was Kanzi. She wasn't actually teaching Kanzi how to communicate with these boards. She was working with Kanzi's mother. He was a 9-month-old infant at the time. And he just played in the lab while the Rumbaughs tried to teach his mother language. And Kanzi spontaneously demonstrated productive competence for lexicograms and receptive competence for spoken English. So apes can understand what you are saying to them. Okay. They can understand whatever spoken language is being used by the people that work with them. Okay. So we say spoken English in this case because this work was done here, but it could be any language, right? They could have competence for spoken Mandarin, for French, for Swahili. It doesn't really matter what that language is. So they can pick up and understand things on the scale of about a 3 to 4 year old child. And if you've ever listened to a 3 to 4 year old, oh my gosh, they never stop talking. Right? They're constantly asking questions, they're constantly playing with language, etc. Kanzi's utterances include grammar, syntax, and semanticity, semantics, right? So he's following, when he uses these communication boards, he's following the rules of English. And that's because that's how the researchers have used these boards with him. And his language skill has enhanced his ability to learn other skills. So Kanzi can manufacture Oldowan style pebble tools. So he can make tools of the type that like Australopithecines would have used. And so this is pretty significant. um, when language is used to teach, right? When we've got the cognition associated with using language, we are primed to learn. And that learning doesn't just take place with language, right? That learning takes place with other aspects of culture as well. And so, um, what does this show us? This shows us that the cognitive basis for not only language, but also human culture is shared with chimpanzees and bonobos, right? And so, what may be holding them back in the wild, per se, is simply not having um, a way in which they can communicate. Their anatomy for their tongue control and their voice box and such is different enough from how our own larynx and pharynx are organized that they cannot utter like the same kind of spoken sounds that we do. But if you choose to, for extra credit this week, there are some TED Talks that you can choose to watch. And one of those is Sue Savage Rumbaugh going over what bonobos are able to do and what Kanzi specifically is able to do. And if you would choose to watch that TED Talk, you will see that Kanzi does have vocalizations or utterances that mean specific things. And so, specifically, in the TED Talk, Sue tells Kanzi that she hears him calling for Austin and using the vocalization that he does for one of the other bonobos' identity. Um, so, this bonobo research has since been halted. Because there were some ethical violations. It was a little crazy. So there were some ethical concerns over the research that was being done. 2015 was the year when a lot of the chimpanzee research was halted for being exploitative, and the fact that chimps are absolutely endangered species and deserve also a quality of care because of their advanced cognition, right? So we don't, these animals are now kind of living out their retirement um, in God, I'm trying to remember. I think it's Iowa. I think they've been moved to Iowa. And so they live in a community that includes a 50-acre wooded forest within a 300-acre woodland preserve. And these locations within the forest and the woodland preserve are labeled with these lexicograms. And what further research has shown is that these bonobos are able to make mental maps of their community and know the forest as well as humans know a village. Bonobos will um, work with other knowledgeable bonobos, others that understand the lexicograms, and will plan where they will go and what they will do when they get there. And they talk about these plans on the communication board. So the degree of metacognition is pretty remarkable. And work on metacognition with orangutans at the National Zoo shows that they've got comparable skills in terms of self awareness, memory, tasks, planning, and intent, communicating that planning and intent. Interestingly, that it now we're understanding a little more about orangutans' vocalizations in the wild, and they're finding out that the long calls that adult male orangutans utter in the wild actually contain a lot of detail. And so it contains these vocalizations contain plans for where the community is going to move and how long they're going to travel in a particular direction, etc. So one of the reasons that we might say that apes don't have language is simply that we cannot understand the language that they do have. They can make vocalizations that we can't hear, for example. And this is also going to be true for species like toothed whales, for dolphins, porpoises, orcas, etc., belugas, right? That by and large, they absolutely do have language. The expectation is that if we could understand their call systems, that toothed whales would demonstrate a lot of these same characteristics, the cultural transmission, the productivity, and the displacement. We just haven't figured out how to kind of crack their code and understand what they're saying. And so there is still work being done on trying to understand the anatomy of language, right? A headline came out just this year that uh, talked about how Neanderthals actually did have voice boxes and pharynxes that could make similar sounds to what anatomically modern humans made. And this was a big deal because for quite some time, the belief was that Neanderthals didn't have spoken language, that they weren't able to make sounds like anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and therefore um, they weren't as smart because of these constraints. So we're finding that language is not based on one key evolved feature, right? So the structure of our larynx absolutely influences the range of sounds that we're able to make. But we also have other features like certain genes that control tongue movement. There is a gene called the FOXP2 gene that helps to explain why humans speak. We have a different form of this gene as compared to chimpanzees. When humans have the chimp version of this gene, which some people do, they're born that way, right? They don't have the fine motor skills of their tongue and lip movement necessary for clear speech. So their speech will always sound kind of garbled or slurred. There's no doubt that language offers an adaptive advantage, and that adaptive advantage really comes in this cultural consolidation that it allows us to store vast amounts of knowledge um, that has an adaptive function that helps us to survive and reproduce, and store it for a very long time and transmit that information easily.